Serbia is pushing ahead with moves to join the European Union, but Brussels is so far unimpressed with its reforms. My guest this week visiting Berlin is the Serbian Prime Minister Ana Brnabić. Why so little progress on so many key issues? Prime Minister Ana Brnabić, welcome to Conflict Zone.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
One of the conditions for Serbia joining the EU is that you sign a legally binding agreement on peaceful relations with Kosovo, which declared its independence in 2008. You've never recognized that. These talks come and go. Sometimes they're on, sometimes they're off. Why should the EU bother with all this feuding and bilateral disputes that you have with Kosovo? You're too much trouble for the EU, aren't you?
I think that as much as our interest is to join the EU, I think the enlargement to cover Balkans is also in the EU's interest. I think first and foremost, the European Union is a peace project, and it's a successful one because we have, for the first time in history, a long-term peace in Europe.
Well, you say that, but the EU has made it clear, haven't they? They cannot and will not import bilateral disputes. Jean-Claude Juncker said it last year. That's pretty clear, isn't it?
It is clear.
They're not going to import your dispute with Kosovo.
It is absolutely clear.
So if you don't settle it, then you're not going to get in, are you?
And that is normal to me. I think that's just a natural thing to do. I would ask that if I were the EU as well.
So you're not going to settle this anytime soon. You've admitted that yourself. So there's really no perspective for you joining in the foreseeable future, is there?
I would 100% disagree with you on that point, because firstly, the soonest possible date for us to join the EU is 2025. So by 2025, I think there is a possibility that we actually sign a long-term normalization agreement with Pristina.
Really? It doesn't look like it at the moment, does it?
I'm not saying that this will happen. I'm saying that Serbia is committed to it. It doesn't depend on Serbia alone. It depends also on Pristina as well as on other allies of ours. So I think we're going in the direction of the EU. For me, what's important is that we actually implement all the reforms so that as a society, politically, economically, we become fit for the EU.
Yeah, but you say that, and I want to come on to those reforms in a little bit, because the EU is far from happy with the state of your reforms. But last week, the EU...
I would also disagree with that.
Firstly, we'll go through it in detail. We'll go through it in detail.
In the enlargement strategy, the EU clearly identified Serbia and Montenegro as frontrunners. I would say that is far from being disappointed with our reforms.
Frontrunners, but the EU is getting fed up with you. And at the Sofia summit in May and later in London, there was a pretty lukewarm attitude to all 6 Balkan countries looking to join the EU. No mention of any timetable for accession, and some pretty clear opposition from the French President Emmanuel Macron, wasn't there? Clear opposition.
Well, let me just say that I do not think that you have the right to say that EU is fed up with us. I don't think it's diplomatic, and I don't think you can say that on behalf of the EU. If the EU was fed up with us, then we would not have any new chapters opened. And we do have new chapters being constantly opened, and that the trend is that we are going towards the EU.
Well, that's not according to President Macron, who said what we've seen over the past 15 years is a path that has weakened Europe every time we think of enlarging it. And I don't think we do a service to the candidate countries or ourselves by having a mechanism that in a way no longer has rules and keeps moving towards more enlargement. That was hardly welcoming you with both arms, was it?
And I agree with President Macron 100%. I do not think that enlargement in the past was particularly successful. I think that
nor likely to be with you coming in. Nor likely to be with you.
And I think that the consequence of that kind of accession to the EU is that the country who's accessing the EU is weaker because its economy cannot compete, its agriculture cannot compete, they suffer from a huge brain drain, and the EU gets weaker.
So why don't you put your membership on hold, stop taking the EU funds, sort out the bilateral problems with Kosovo and all the other reforms?
What do you mean our membership on hold?
Well, how much money do you get from the EU?
We are getting
hundreds of millions.
We are getting much less than that. We are getting pre-accession funds. And the pre-accession funds are much smaller than for the funds that the EU member states are getting.
Well, you've given the impression that you're in it just for the money, aren't you?
That is completely not right.
Really, your president Vučić himself.
If I can just say, or you can have your interview with yourself, if I can just say something. Firstly, we've always said to our citizens that we cannot and will not look towards the EU as a pot of money, that the better quality of life, the jobs, better salaries need to come from ourselves and the strength of our economy, that we want to be part of the EU because EU is a peace project and we have shared values with the EU.
So if that's true, why did President Vučić 3 years ago, when he was Prime Minister, make it clear when he told a meeting in Tirana, we are fed up with seminars. We need some money from the EU funds. Then you'll see the smiles on our faces. That would be a clear indication that he was simply after the money.
I would say that you took out that statement, if it's correct, and I do not remember that statement.
It is correct. It was reported on multiple news agencies.
Completely out of the context. If anything, President Vučić, as the Prime Minister, repeatedly said EU is not a pot of money for us. We need to take care of our own economy, our jobs, our infrastructure. The EU is a different goal for Serbia. Now, whether we're going to be ready by 2025 to join the EU is another question. And I think if you ask me, if the EU said you can join tomorrow, I'd say no, because we're not ready. Which would mean that, again, we get an enlargement in which Serbia would be worse off and Europe would be worse off.
But when it comes to Kosovo,
I am more interested in the reforms themselves.
When it comes to Kosovo, Prime Minister, you keep raising the bar, don't you? You now say that any final deal will have to be comprehensive. It will have to include, among other things, human rights, minority rights, economic cooperation, learning each other's language and cultural heritage. You said all this in a recent...
Absolutely. How is that raising the bar?
It's going to take a long time, 20 years at least. Why should the EU wait around for that?
But who says that EU will wait around for that? If it takes 20 years, obviously we won't join the EU. Who says that EU will wait around? Who's asking the EU to wait around?
You are. You're continuing with your membership application, aren't you?
But of course.
So you want it to wait around?
But of course, because we want to become members of the EU. But I'm more interested in the reforms. Once we implement the reforms, the EU will come as a natural consequence of these reforms. If they want to wait around, that's fine. If they don't want to wait around, that's also
fine too, is it?
That will not change.
You don't mind whether they wait around or not?
That will not change Serbian policies a little bit. What we are doing in terms of the reforms, we are doing first and foremost because of our own citizens and our businesses, for the quality of life of citizens in Serbia.
Okay, well, let's talk about the reforms in detail.
Let me just tell you what the EU is for us. Firstly, the reforms on our EU accession path mean that we have strong, stable economy, that we implement structural reforms that will lead to strong, stable economy.
And what about human rights, press freedom, things like that? What about press freedom, for instance?
If you let me finish, I'll come to that. The second pillar is efficient, transparent public administration. The third pillar is the rule of law. More stronger, more independent, but also more efficient and more accountable judiciary.
Let's talk about press freedom. One of the most glaring failures of your government has been your refusal to protect freedom of speech. In February, the Council of Europe's Human Rights Commissioner said the atmosphere in which journalists work in Serbia appears to have deteriorated quite seriously, especially with the smear campaigns against journalists, with some politicians calling them traitors, foreign agents and mercenaries. You have denied that any of this is the case, but Europe isn't buying your denials, is it?
Well, firstly, I see that there is a freedom of media in Serbia. I see...
No smear campaigns against journalists?
I see criticism of the president, of myself, of the government, every single day in the media, as it should be.
What about the smear campaigns against journalists?
As it should be in any democratic society.
Prime Minister, let me give you an example. Alexander Martinovic, senior official of your ruling Progressive Party, he labeled the head of the Independent Journalists Association of Vojvodina an enemy of Serbia because he'd made critical comments about the authorities. Is that acceptable? He's an enemy of Serbia?
I'm not saying that it's acceptable. For
You're
one
saying
thing,
it doesn't happen.
Well, for one thing, I'm saying that there is a media freedom in Serbia. I'm saying that there is media freedom in Serbia.
And they're saying the atmosphere in which journalists work in Serbia appears to have deteriorated quite seriously because of these smear campaigns.
Absolutely do not agree with that. In Serbia...
You think the EU makes it up?
Listen, in Serbia, about 10 years ago or a little bit over that, when we actually had a democratically oriented political party in power, the members of the ruling coalition physically kicked journalists.
So you think it's an improvement now that they're just threatened?
The Anti-Corruption Council said that media is completely politically influenced. I think we have a lot to deal with in Serbia, and we are dealing with it. And I think the situation is improving. It's by no means worse than it used to be.
Last month, an official from the Security Information Agency, the BIA, Marko Parezanovic, said the greatest threat to Serbia are the foreign agents working in media, non-governmental agencies, and opposition parties. It's an easy smear, isn't it, to talk about foreign agents in the media when you have no evidence for that whatsoever?
It is absolutely ridiculous to quote one public servant at a conference where the president of Serbia talked about threats and I talked about threats. And you have the president and the prime minister talking about threats, which is migration, terrorism, cybersecurity, and Kosovo and Metohija. And no one is quoting that the actual official policy of Serbia has never ever said that the media is problematic.
You think this is all taken out of context? In its latest report...
I think that you had two of the highest officials of Serbia saying what the threats are. And everyone disregarding this just so that someone can take words of one single public servant...
Prime Minister, if that were the case, in its latest report in April, the European Commission said the fact that no progress had been made to safeguard freedom of expression was a matter of increasing concern. That was in April. Serbian authorities, said the Commission, need to provide active support to independent bodies, human rights defenders and independent journalists, and promptly react to and publicly condemn the threats against them. So why don't you do what the Commission asks you to do?
I've done exactly the thing that the Commission asked me to do. And
but they say you haven't.
And thank you so much for that. But let's see the upcoming report. Thank you for that question. Actually, in fact, as the Prime Minister, I sat down with all the media representatives, talked to them about what we can do to come up with a credible media strategy. They've asked me, for me personally, to run the working group, are actually in my cabinet, in my team, and not under the Ministry of Culture and Information, that we have the working group to work on the media strategy. This is exactly what we're doing right now. With the support of the European Commission, that is the European delegation in Serbia, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, the OSCE, and the Norwegian Embassy in Serbia.
Okay.
And then, and also the
and
media.
This is not getting through to Europe. This is not getting through to Europe.
You will see in the next,
really?
in the upcoming report, and also
access
the
to
media,
public information. Will we see improvements there as well?
Also, of course,
really,
because we've in the meantime.
Because that's not going well either, is it?
If I can,
that's not going well either, is it?
No, it's going really well.
Really?
So I'll tell you. Also, the media representatives asked that we have a coordination body also under my cabinet as the Prime Minister, which will, in parallel with media strategy, work on resolving ad hoc issues that media have in Serbia. We've agreed to that as well. We are doing that. They meet once a month and are already resolving issues. If you want to, my government is the first government to actually implement the open data policy. We are doing that together with the United Nations.
But earlier this
year, the Parliament has adopted the law on e-government, which makes opening data in Serbia mandatory.
I understand that earlier this year, the Council of Europe...
It did not really seem to me that you do understand.
I understand what you're saying, but the EU disagrees with it, and so does the Council of Europe and their Human Rights Commissioner, who complained in his report earlier this year that things with regard to access to information are not going well. The government is not implementing the recommendations of the Commissioner for Information of Public Importance, and the Parliament is not discussing his reports. You want to continue down this road? Because they're not buying your denials of this, are they?
I'm not saying that these are denials. There is so much work to be done. And I'm saying, I said yesterday at the conference of Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, I think if we look at our EU integration in three key pillars, economy, public administration, and rule of law, by far the most was done in the economy. I would say in terms of structural reforms, 85% of the job has been done, which is shown in the numbers that Serbia has right now. Our GDP growth in this year was 4.5%. Our unemployment halved. We are the world leaders in FDI attraction. In terms of public administration reform, probably 50% of the job has done. Still a long way to go. In terms of the rule of law, 30% has been done. So we have a long, long way to go.
You have a long way to go on the issue of war crimes as well, where the EU is still not satisfied with your performance.
Well, EU is certainly not 100% satisfied with our performance.
Far less than 100%, isn't it?
I would say that Serbia, by far, is the best case example in the region of how to deal with the war crimes.
Really? Between January 2016 and May 2017, Serbia had no formally appointed war crimes prosecutor for 17 months.
And that's
done. So that was a way of showing your willingness to deal with this? And 17 months.
Not just that. You can absolutely not disregard everything that Serbia has been doing with respect to the war crimes since in the last 18 years.
Okay,
and
according
it has
to the
done
agreed action
by far
plan,
the most of all other countries in the region.
According to the agreed action plan for Chapter 23 of your EU application, 5 additional deputy prosecutors should have been appointed by the end of 2017. Why weren't they? If you're doing everything you need to do.
Well, to be honest, I don't know the answer to that question, but we've appointed them now. And I have to say that, you have, priorities first. And Serbia, literally 4 years ago, was 3 months away from bankruptcy, which goes to say that we really had to focus all of our effort, all of our strength on very difficult, very unpopular economic reforms. You cannot do everything at the same time.
So far, there have been no indictments against senior military or police officials for war crimes. There are currently 15 cases ongoing. The majority involve low-ranking military or police defendants. What's the deal? The higher-ups, the senior officers get away with it and the lower ones take the prosecutions? Is that it?
I do not agree with you. And again, I think that Serbia has done by far the most. Still there is a job to be done. But I think that Serbia, and I am absolutely proud with how Serbia has handled our issues from the past.
Are you proud of the trend in Serbia that the EU points to see former war criminals as heroes or role models? Do you subscribe to that?
No, I do not. I do not. I think that we see in other countries in the region that war criminals actually, or indicted war criminals actually have official roles as advisors to the presidents or in the government. We see some being even the prime ministers, but in Serbia you do not have those kind of things.
You have Vladimir Lazarevic, for instance, convicted for crimes against ethnic Albanians in Kosovo. He's appointed lecturer at the Serbian Military Academy.
Not true. He was convicted, he served his sentence, he was released, he's in Serbia now. He was one time guest lecture at the military academy on, if I'm not mistaken, on what was the combat during the NATO bombing campaign over Serbia. So he's not appointed a lecturer at the military academy.
Nikola Sejnovic, convicted of similar acts, later reappointed to his old position as a member of the Executive Council of the Serbian Socialist Party. Happy with that?
That is Serbian Socialist Party. It has nothing to do with the government. It has nothing to do with the official functions in the Republic of Serbia.
Rehabilitated into public life in Serbia?
These people, what do you want me to do with these people? If they were convicted, served their sentence, and released, do you want us to lock them up in Serbia so they can not show their faces anywhere?
You want them to sit in parliament, like Vojislav Šešelj, for instance?
What with Vojislav Šešelj?
A man who says he's proud of all the war crimes and crimes against humanity that were attributed to him?
I will remind you, while talking about the rule of law, that Vojislav Šešelj handed himself to the Hague Tribunal voluntarily, had a 13 years trial. Is that what you call rule of law? And was then acquitted, came back to Serbia, and then...
the acquittal was overturned this year.
It was overturned. It was overturned. But 13 years trial.
He received a 10-year sentence, but he was free because of time served.
But of course.
Okay.
Of course, they still owe him at least 3 years of his life.
Nemanja Stepanovic from the Center. Nemanja Stepanovic from the Center for Humanitarian Law in Belgrade says Serbia has not moved an inch from the time when the wars were being fought in the 1990s. As one after another war criminals are released and given a ceremonial reception by the government on their return, they're being ushered back into public institutions, he said.
I'm just telling you that that's not true. So he can say whatever.
He doesn't know what he's talking about.
I disagree with him. So, and to say that Serbia hasn't done anything is unbelievable.
I didn't say it hasn't done anything. I said it hasn't done enough according to the EU.
Hasn't done enough. Okay, perhaps we can do more, and we will, to ensure the rule of law in Serbia, and to deal with the past and turn towards the future. Serbia will do its part, but I would actually caution everyone not to really look at Serbia alone, but to also look at what other countries in the region are doing.
Does doing what's expected of it for you include acknowledging that the massacre at Srebrenica in 1995 was genocide? You were asked in May last year by the Council of Europe to recognize Srebrenica as genocide. You've never done that. Are you prepared to do that?
No, I do not think that the terrible crime, massacre in Srebrenica, was a genocide.
You must know that unless you take this step, the chances of you joining the European Union are very slim, aren't they?
I don't know that. Because it was a hideous crime. It was a war crime. I am not happy because of it. It wasn't done in the name of Serbian people. And Serbs cannot be collectively be blamed for what happened there.
Two courts, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and the International Court of Justice, both ruled that it was genocide.
Okay.
And you won't accept it.
I do not think it was a genocide.
You're rewriting history, aren't you? Trying to rewrite history.
I do not think it was a genocide. I think it was, but let me just say, it seems like, I think it was a terrible, terrible crime. But genocide is basically when you are, genocide is when you are, killing the entire population, the women, children, and this was not that case.
In 2004, the presiding judge at the Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia said by seeking to eliminate a part of the Bosnian Muslims, the Bosnian Serb forces committed genocide. They targeted for extinction the 40,000 Bosnian Muslims living in Srebrenica, a group which was emblematic of the Bosnian Muslims in general. That's why it was labeled genocide.
Okay.
And if you can't accept it, why should
accepting it that it was a terrible crime. Serbia delivered the person who was charged with that war crime. We've delivered that person. He was on trial. He's in jail now.
But you won't accept the step which the Council of Europe asks you to accept.
That it was a genocide.
Yeah.
I'm telling you, it was a
That's
terrible
your
crime.
red line, is it?
I'm telling you.
You're never going to do it.
I told you my answer.
Prime Minister Brnabić, thank you very much for being on Conflict Zone.
Thank you.